I'm delighted to be here, and Jennifer's talk was really inspiring, and I agree with practically everything she said. So let me start by introducing myself. I'm a filmmaker, I'm a visual artist, a writer, a producer, and mainly a juggler. And uh, people could say that that's too much happening, but they're all really facets of the same thing. Because as a creative in general, what I seek most is a form of expression and a form, actually, let's boil it down to I really want to change the world. And graduating from university, I thought that I could do it single handedly. But little by little, I realized that all I can really do is change a little bit, and starting mainly with myself and with at least the industry I'm working in. And so maybe what I I think would be useful is to talk about really the crossroads and the episodes where decisions are vital. I come from a background, I'm from the South, and I was looking through all the people on the Zoom. I feel very lonely down here. And I come from the South. I'm Egyptian, but I mean, I have multiple passports, unlike many of my fellow people from the South. So I'm Egyptian, I'm French, I'm South African, I'm Lebanese, all for different reasons, and that's where the crossroads comes in. Um, I um, I think my father was a diplomat, and I grew up thinking that that's what I'm going to do. And I passed the test, and I became a diplomat for about 3 months, until the person who was the head of the diplomatic institute at the time, who was Boutros Ghali, who later became Secretary General of the United Nations and the rest of it, was a very close friend of my father's, called me in and he said, Jihan, you have to change the way you laugh, the way you act, the way you do this, the way you do that. Otherwise, you cannot be an Egyptian diplomat. And I looked at him and was like, what do you mean? He says, here, this is the way it works. If you're a woman coming into the diplomatic service, either you keep a very low profile for a very long time, about 30, 40 years, until you become ambassador, and then you can be whoever you want to be. So I was a bit stunned by, oh my God, what am I supposed to do now? So I literally upped and left and went on to be a war photographer. Quite a shift. But at the time, it was the time of the war in Lebanon, and nobody was really understanding because of the conflict was so complicated. And I thought that just by capturing one image at a time, I could transmit one story at a time. And I went on to be a war photographer for quite a while. And then that too showed its limits, because a frame at a time doesn't really give you the context and the why and the how. And so I became a journalist, and I was the Washington Post correspondent in North Africa. And basically, writing was one way of doing it. But then that's the second major crossroad was I suddenly realized that to be a journalist, you only have that many hours to find the person you get the quote from, to be out and about and understand what's going on. And I felt that I was writing the first draft of history. So although I really covered the war properly, got a nice award for it, and the rest of it. I was deeply depressed at the fact that what I was doing, although very important, was actually changing the world in a way I was not happy with. Because if I only had 3 hours to get a quote from somebody, it was really the person who answered the phone, or I could track down who was going to tell me what it was. Um, and I wasn't happy with that. And plus, the Gulf War for me was a really, really trying moment, because being someone who was a global citizen, I spoke many languages, I fit in everywhere, I could be whoever I wanted to be. But there was this moment during the Gulf War where people had to choose sides. And I didn't want to choose sides. I wanted to make the world a better place. Because I didn't really fit in any side. And so basically, after a moment of depression and trying to figure out what is it that actually would allow me to do all the other things I've been doing, but find a different articulation. And that's how I got to documentary. I actually watched this one documentary. It was called Death of Yugoslavia. And I watched it and I said, that's what I want to do. That's what combines understanding with context, with people telling their stories from their perspective, not just the tag, the line that needs to be said because it's a headline. And I was at the time working in a company in Paris. And after watching that documentary, I literally got on the train and went to that British company. And I told them, would you hire me? And they looked at me as I was like, no, we won't. I said, I'll be the coffee boy. I'll be anything you want. But I want to make the films you make. And they kind of looked at my CV and said, why do you want to work with us? And I said, because I think you're doing something really important. So eventually they did take me on at a much lower whatever. But the point was, I had finally figured out what it is, at least the form, that I think would make a difference. And I had to go out and find a way to make that happen. So that was the first crossroad. And from there on, I think a friend in Namibia said it best. It was quite heavy, and he always called me the feather, and I thought he was insulting me. He's like, "Why are you calling me a feather?" I'm like, "I'm not really thin." He says, "Because you tend to blow where the wind takes you," and I initially didn't really understand what he meant, but then I realized that it really is about, at every crossroad, will you allow yourself to go where you believe the next important step is, or are you going to stop there and think about the risk, the stability, and all these items? I guess it's a price to pay, and it's also a form of freedom that isn't easy to live up to. I was making a film in the Congo, and I just had my daughter, and it was at a very critical moment, and I was breastfeeding. And of course, everybody around me was like, of course you can't finish the film. And I was like, why not? It's like, you have a baby. I was like, well, why can't the baby come with me to the Congo? It's like, because there's a war in the Congo. It's like, but there are 4 million children in the Congo. Why is my child any different? So I basically strapped her on my back, and I went and filmed and breastfed at the same time. So, when there was this question a minute ago about the younger generation feeling that they don't have a choice, I do believe that the younger generation feel they don't have a choice, because I mentor quite a bit in film, and the people I mentor often say, "Oh, but we can't do this because that's the only format." And I say, "No, you do have a choice, but every choice comes with a price. Are you willing to pay that price? Are you willing to do that extra legwork? Are you willing to fail? I mean, nothing's impossible, but we can fail." And I think it's these parameters that are very personal, but it's the sense that we don't have a choice is all around us. Like, again, I'm going to have to keep it within my industry. I guess when I was talking about this moment of the crossroad in the Gulf War, am I going to go in this direction, that direction? What am I going to do? It was also tied up to a sense of identity, of who am I? What does Egyptian actually mean? And all these questions had to send me really into realizing that it's not these definitions, that the labels that are tagged out there. If you're Egyptian, that's what you are. And if you're this, that's what you are. It really is what this identity question is going to be with us the whole time. But where do you want to take it? How far do you want to accept it? How different are you? And as an artist, by definition, I'm not going to fit in. Someone's always going to say, "Oh, but you're not typical this or you're not typical that." So I might as well just live up to it and do what I believe is right. And why it's right, it's not just right from a personal perspective. It's right because I still want to change the world. Even if I don't, but at least I'm going to try. Um, uh, uh, you know, that, that trajectory, if the end result is the only aim, I think things become very rigid, and exploration and understanding and diversity are always put aside. It's once we're on that journey to our aim, we keep our minds and ears and hearts open to maybe change that trajectory. And maybe it'll be bigger. And it's not about being confused. So when I started by saying I'm a visual artist and a photographer and, for people who need the labels, it might sound confusing because they don't know where to box me, because I don't want to be boxed. But all of them are different aspects of addressing the themes that you feel are important. And so I don't know if I'm really straying or not, but we live in a world today that is becoming more and more formatted. The concept of globalization is fantastic, but if globalization means that everyone has to look the same and everyone has to speak the same, and what kind of a world would that be? And I think that acceptance of specificity and acceptance of diversity is our first mission right now, at least mine, is breaking these formats. So, for example, at one point, I got really obsessed with one word, a word which is sub-Saharan Africa. And I was like, where did that come from? I can't find it on any map. What is included? What is excluded? And I went on a real investigation as to what does this word actually mean? Who does it include and who does it exclude? I'll spare you the details, but basically I was convinced that it's a colonial term, but it turns out to be a post-colonial term. And more today, the divisions in the film world and on the continent are completely based on this imaginary line. And this imaginary line, for example, the Sahara, Sudan is below the Sahara, and it is called Middle East. And Mauritania is above the Sahara, and it's called Sub-Saharan. And all these terminologies serve the purpose of funding. And so we start fitting into these criterias in order to be able to get the funding that only exists. You need to tick these boxes. And by ticking these boxes constantly, what we're doing is that we're changing who we are. And we're robbing the world of a form of diversity. So when I'm currently the Director General of an institution that supports, funds, and trains Arab and African documentary. And when I was first hired, the institution was a funding and training institution for Arab filmmakers. And my first question was, what does Arab mean? Does it include the Berbers? Does it include the Kurds? Does it include the Tuareg? There's so many non-ethnic Arabs in the Arab world. So I guess the reason I'm getting into these details is that the criteria of boxing people into these little niches are very often criteria that facilitate funding, that basically take away the complexity of the world we live in. I'm very much for things not being complicated, but complex is not complicated. Complex is what we have to deal with in our daily lives, and knowing that there are different levels and different stratas and different people. And yeah, and as a woman in the Middle East, of course, that doesn't help. I'm required to be this or that at different moments. But, you know, I think also the reason I'm currently involved in films that are very much oriented towards political history is that history is a very, very important thing not to forget, because we are the outcome of the different moments and these different crossroads that we go through. So in my country, for example, in Egypt, Egypt had one of the oldest feminist movements in the world. In 1919, Egyptian women went out on demonstrations against the colonial powers. In 1928, they brought down governments. 1950, they were discussing suffrage, voting. And look where we're at today. I mean, it's quite dramatic. But I think where we're at today is the outcome of many layers of complexity. So if we just look at it through the prism of women's oppression, we will not resolve issues. Religion has come in, politics has come in, the change of the engagement of our country with other countries has shifted. So many parameters have shifted that have affected the voice of women. And myself, at least one of these women, I will not allow my voice to be silenced, either by not being able to tick the right box for funding, or because these are the parameters you're allowed to work in this country or that country. I don't know. there's so many opportunities out there, and we can do things. It's just about how do you decide to proceed. So one of the things I always do with my films, I got clever with time. Um, um, Confrontation is not the best way. Understanding the other and recognizing the difference between when people listen to you and when they start hearing you does not really depend on what you're saying. It depends on what you're touching in them, what you're triggering in them to allow them to say, yes, I understand that. And that's the word we call universality in filmmaking terms. But universality does not need to deny specificity. You can be very universal from a very, very specific local story that can resonate with the whole world. So the way I've proceeded is that every film I start to make, I try and find in it what the others are gonna be able to hear in order to give me the space for me to then tell the story I want to tell. Yeah, that's about it.